The best line I have heard today, Mommy, what was it like to live through COVID's 1 to 18? Welcome to State of the Economy and what it means to FP&A. In case you get bored partway through my presentation, allow me to summarize the state of the economy. It's bad. And what it means for FP&A, lots and lots and lots of work. For the details, you're going to have to actually pay attention for the next 45 minutes. I'm Edward Roske, CEO here at interRel, and I've been helping finance departments deal with uncertainty for over 25 years. You're here today because you want to understand what is the financial impact of coronavirus? How does it affect the economy? How does it affect my industry? How does it affect my company? How does it affect my department? How does it affect me specifically? We want to make sure that our department is critically important during these uncertain times. Job security is critical. I want to let you know how to make your department critical. I'm going to make sure that you walk away with more knowledge than anybody else at your company, and I'm going to give you some physical actions that you can take now. These are the official jobless claims for the week ending March 28, 2020, just came out this morning. And it beats by basically an order of magnitude the jobless claims from March 28, 2009. Side note, what is it about March 28th? I think we should petition to move the Ides of March from the 5th of March to the 28th of March. Sorry, Julius Caesar, you had your time, but apparently there's something very wrong with this day. So that gives us a real-time unemployment rate of 10.1%, and it's doubtless higher than that right now. I've talked to hundreds of people over the last few weeks, and they're all across what I have taken to calling the Serenity spectrum. At one end, we have the everybody just needs to calm down. This is all overblown. It's media driven. It's either trying to get this person elected or this other person elected, or it was created and it's all going to be okay. It turns out it's just the flu. Well, if you're at this end, this is all hype. It's a momentary blip. Things will go back to normal as soon as we're out of our houses again. If you think this might be bad for other businesses, but you won't be impacted much, I'm going to expand your thinking. I'm going to shift your perspective. We are an interconnected world. All businesses are going to be affected. If you're at the opposite end, this is the end of the economy as we know it. OMG, OMG, we're all going to die. If you don't know where to start, if you're overwhelmed by the possibilities, I'm going to give you some concrete actions you can take. I'm going to give you a realistic view because it turns out what scares people is uncertainty. The truth we can handle. We've been dealing with it for hundreds of thousands of years. So as long as we have the correct bit of information, we know what our constraints are. We know what we can deal with. If you're somewhere in the middle, like Socrates, who passed his amazing philosophical knowledge on to Plato, who passed his great knowledge on to Aristotle, who passed his knowledge on to Alexander the Great, who used it to dominate and conquer the entire known world. If you are somewhere in the middle, I'm going to deep dive into a lot of the things that you've been doing. I'm going to give you some additional information to include. We're also all here today as part of uncertainty planning to make sure that we are sharing information with each other. So I encourage all of us to get a dialogue going, figure out how we can better communicate, and this doesn't end today. Because we're facing an extremely uncertain time. Now, a lot of us are concerned right now on a personal level. We're concerned about disease transmission. How do we stop the spread of the virus? Because we don't know how bad it's going to be. The United States alone, ranges of deaths are anywhere from 100,000 to 240,000. Some people say with social distancing, quarantining, staying from home, it could come in under 100,000. Some people say the cat's already out of the bag. It's going to be north of 240,000. So we need to understand how it's spreading, but at the end of the day, that's not something that we know until it actually occurs. And we don't know how bad the economic side is going to be. Now, from a business side, there is an economic portion where it overlaps with the medical portion. Are our employees going to be okay? Is our business going to be able to continue operating if everyone is working from home? How will travel bans, being able to get outside of the house, affect us? And we also have a lot of internal business uncertainty. How will the economy affect me? What will the demand look like for my products and services? How will my personal supply chain be disrupted from a business standpoint? And with all this world of uncertainty, how do we plan for it? How do we communicate? How do we respond to events in real time? I feel that we've been playing somewhat a game of Survivor. Our goal for today is to make sure that you leave being the most important person in your department, and that your department is the most important one in your whole company. There is going to be a recession. I'll try not to use that word any more than 173 times in the next 45 minutes. If there is a recession, your group is going to be the last one anybody thinks about voting off the island. And at times of danger, crisis, panic, disruption, pending economic collapse, apocalypse, and survival, I pause and I encourage all of you to do the same, to remember the Serenity Prayer. Grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Because this is applicable in your personal life, but it's also applicable in business. I'm going to reference this multiple times today. I want you to pause for a moment and think about coronavirus, think about the economy, think about your business. What can we change, and what do we just have to deal with because it's out of our control? I put this together in what I'm calling the interRel Serenity Plan. This is the best way to graph the Serenity prayer onto a quadrant, because everything is better if you can figure out a way to represent it in a PowerPoint slide. So once we have the wisdom spectrum, we can determine what we cannot control and what we can control. And there are a lot of things we can't control. We can't personally stop COVID-19 from spreading around the world. I know when we were kids, Smokey Bear taught us only you can prevent forest fires, but he wasn't counting for pandemics, so you can't control it. You can't control the stock market. You can't control supply chain interruptions. You can't control the value of your 401k, although that would be awesome. You can't control global demand for your company's products or this weird panic hoarding of toilet paper and bottled water. As much as I would like to reach out and tell the entire world there isn't a situation by which your tap water stops working and plastic's bad for the environment, I can't do it. But there are a lot of things in our control. In our personal lives, we can keep ourselves safe. We can stay home. We can use social distancing. We can slow the spread of the virus in our social circle. But in our corporate lives, and that's why you all are here, there are even more things we can control. We can control working capital, scenario planning, reporting, analytics, cost controls, supply chain risk mitigation, shareholder communication, employee communication. There are things we can control, but we have to do them now. Side note, I live in Arlington, Texas, and the city has started posting these signs all over the city, the parks, the playgrounds. They've taken down all the basketball hoops, taken down all the volleyball nets. I love this because if Qui-Gon Jinn had stood far enough back not to get killed by Darth Maul's lightsaber, he also would have been safe from coronavirus. Yes, the city of Arlington has made a Star Wars prequel reference, and that just kind of makes me happy. So in addition to physical distancing, what can we control? Well, we can start by understanding our risks and how to mitigate them. An article on CFO.com said we need to get a handle on 3 things before it's too late to do anything about them. 1, company liquidity. How much money do I have or that I have access to, and when's it going to run out? 2, our supply chain. What are the single points of failure, and how do I give myself multiple options for responding if my supply chain is interrupted? And 3, company guidance. We have to have open conversations with our shareholders and our leaders about what we're expecting. Wall Street and banks hate uncertainty. In terms of liquidity, we have to think ahead at least 1 to 2 quarters. Will we see demand dropping for our goods and services? Will our customers delay payments? Will we have issues getting our products to market? What will happen to my revenue, and how can I control my expenses accordingly? Visibility into our supply chain is crucial. It determines our company's success. It lets us respond to unexpected diversions. Delays or disruptions in getting materials from our suppliers, that can lead to late deliveries to customers. It could strain or even end our existing customer relationships just when we need them most. In a lot of cases, we have suppliers that have force majeure act of God clauses that say under certain situations, natural disasters, we can get out of supplying things to us, or we can get out of supplying things to other people. But is that even being triggered? A lot of act of God force majeure clauses only talk about natural disasters and do not include the concept of pandemics. So understand what's in all those contracts. MD&A is management discussion and analysis. People tend to think of it as being backwards looking, but it's guidance about the future too. Shareholders, potential investors, they rely heavily on our earnings releases and our guidance when making investment decisions. The recent market volatility has shown some substantial investor uncertainty regarding the severity and the duration of the coronavirus financial impact. In light of this fast evolving situation, we have to give more guidance, not less. Wall Street, the stock market will pummel your stock if you don't give them guidance. We are all concerned with the spread of the virus globally and locally, but it turns out we can't personally change it. What we can change is how we use that disease spread information, how we visualize it, how we incorporate it in with our own information. One of the interRel tribe, Sarah, made up this analysis for me during the lunch hour. So this is fresh and up to date, literally just posted on the CDC's website. Sarah did this in Oracle Analytics, and you could also do it in Oracle EPM Cloud or whatever tool you have handy. We just happen to own Oracle Analytics and Oracle EPM Cloud and interRel. I'm analyzing here confirmed coronavirus cases by state. I encourage you to analyze in real time whatever your 5 key indicators are that drive the 95% of your business. If you do analyze virus counts, instead of using a generic map, use your own company's map of your locations so that you can see the likely areas that are going to be affected. Right now, they're the areas we tend to talk about: New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Louisiana, Florida, California, Illinois. We also have some areas that aren't getting as much attention, like Michigan is also in that same bucket of 6,000 plus cases. We then see our next wave. We see Washington State, which in some cases is already bending their curve down because they were an early outbreak area. But we also see Georgia, we see Pennsylvania. Then we see that next tier back: Colorado, New York, Connecticut. And what are they going to do? I was curious to see how coronavirus cases stacked up season to date compared to flu cases, so I asked Sarah to prepare this analysis. It's not amazingly insightful, except you can tell that in the USA so far, it's about 0.6% cases of coronavirus to flu. It will get worse, but so far we've had over 34 million flu cases this year. And unlike flu, no one has immunities to COVID-19. So even if the mortality rate is less once we test people and get tests from asymptomatic people, it is going to be bad. Just right now, it doesn't stack up comparatively to influenza. But I can't control people's panic. I can't control their fear. What I can control is our corporate actions, because this is going to be disruptive, but what can you do to minimize the risk of these disruptions? What can we do to capitalize on some of these changes? What can we plan ahead for? What can we react to in real time? So I'm going to show you a few different charts. So I've gone out and surveyed 114 companies on what their company was focusing on in terms of dealing with COVID-19. I'm going to start by showing you the chart from 3 weeks ago, then I'll show you last week, and then I'll take it up through yesterday. 3 weeks ago, companies were focusing on teaching us that our kindergarten teacher might have been right and we should probably wash our hands more often, and we probably should do it for longer. Companies were starting to limit travel, and they were beginning to think about remote work. I color-coded the items that are related to slowing disease transmission. I color-coded those as blue. I color-coded things related to finance as red, and items that were more related to controlling spending. You could argue that they're financial related. You could argue their response to the disease transmission. I color-coded those as purple, or whatever that kind of light. Is that a fuchsia? I guess it is. The purple things are definitely financial activities, but they're not things that happen entirely in the finance department. Now notice, 3 weeks ago, you had to get down to number 5 on the board before you found one related to FP&A. The highest of those, scenario planning, was only being done at about 1/3 of companies at the time. Only 1 in 9 companies on March 11th was giving guidance to their shareholders, the street, or other external people about what they expected to see with those impacted 2020 numbers. And in some cases, the guidance they gave the street was, we're retracting our previous guidance. Now we're going to jump ahead 2 weeks to last week. Keep in mind that scenario planning one, where it says creating alternate financial scenarios. Scenario planning is not a new concept. There have been companies that have been doing great things with it, dating back to, the first time I really heard about it was 9/11, because there were some companies that went into 9/11 thinking there's never going to be a situation by which they shut down all consumer flying. but certain people planned for it. Southwest Airlines planned for it, and then they had that scenario ready when 9/11 actually did happen. And a lot of companies said, yes, we have to do scenario planning. We have to have these ready at hand plans where if this occurs, this is how I'm going to respond. And they just never got around to building them. And this case is a good example of companies that knew they should have those alternate scenarios. What if something does happen that's really, really bad? They just didn't actually have it done. Now let's go to last week. This helps us really appreciate how time flies. It's hard to believe that this all really just started impacting us in the last month. Notice 2 weeks later, number 1, number 2, number 3 things companies were doing: limiting domestic travel, working from home, limiting international travel. 80% of respondents were dealing with governments mandating that we work from home. But check out the increase in the financial related functions. Scenario planning went from a little over 30% to now being done 2 weeks later at over 70% of companies. And they were scrambling because they didn't have a lot of scenario planning systems in place. Spending limits are now in place at 60+% of companies, profitability analysis at 27% of companies. So we have some idea of what products, services, locations, which customers are making money versus which ones are costing us money. Real-time analytics, shareholder guidance at over 20%. And we see that people weren't looking at FP&A 3 weeks ago, but they sure were last week. So I completed another poll of everyone just yesterday. Discretionary spending limits has now jumped up 2 more spots on our list, and it's now in place at over 80% of companies. But 1 week later, check out profitability. This has actually grown the most. It's now being done right now at over 50% of companies. And also notice shareholder guidance. It was 22% last week, it's 37% this week. That is a more than 50% increase in the number of companies doing it in 1 week. And good thing, since for many companies their first quarter has just closed, so it'll be time to report numbers here in April. So the good idea to give some idea of what those numbers are going to look like before we get it announced and things start tanking. We can't control demand for our products. We would really like to. So I, again, go back to 3 weeks ago, surveyed companies on how do you expect COVID-19 to affect your revenue. At the time, 3 weeks ago, when it was already starting to break out around the world and people were starting to talk about financial impacts, 16% said it's going to significantly decrease our revenue. 39% said somewhat decrease, but 37% of companies at the time, 3 weeks ago, thought this is not going to impact our revenue. Proving that in every crisis, some company turns out to be that privately held firm that makes Purell. 5% of companies expected their revenue to increase either somewhat or significantly. Side note, I saw a brief mini documentary on the history of the company. I want to say it's called Gojo, the family-oriented firm that tried to create Purell and get everybody caught on. Fun fact, it used to have just one L. They added the second one to make it easier to pronounce. So now that we're doing the survey every week, we can see how things have changed. Now, we did have to split the question because when we first asked it, we just said, are you thinking this might impact your revenue? Now we broke it into short term, next 3 months, and long term over the next 12 months. I'll show you long term in a second. So we've gone from 16% thought revenue would significantly decrease to now 38.3% thought it would significantly decrease. Total share of companies thinking their revenue would decrease in the next 3 months is just shy of 75%. Now we're down to 19% of companies expect their revenues to stay the same as the original forecast. In case you were thinking that impact was going to go away soon, long term, we get up to over 80% of companies expect their revenue to miss forecast in the next 12 months. That's actually more companies, if you notice this graph versus the last one, more companies now expect their revenue to fall than in the next 3 months. Presumably that's because some companies have contracts for the next 3 months, they have revenue guaranteed to come in, but it's going to fall as global demand ends up falling. And let's jump ahead to this week. So now we see that we have 34.2% of companies and significantly decrease in the next 3 months, 41% or over 75% say the revenue is going to decrease. And we are seeing some increase in the revenue growing bucket. So some companies that were indeed worried have come out of that gray area and gone one direction or the other. They've either gone to our revenue is going to go down or our revenue is going to go up. Long term, we're looking at slightly less. companies are thinking their revenue is going to decrease than we saw a week ago. And again, we are seeing some companies, again, dropping. So in the next 12 months, we're down to only 1 in 8 companies expect their revenue to stay the same. One of the things that we can control is our own knowledge, how much understanding we have, how much education we can get. All of you here today are my type of people. You believe in learning things and you believe in passing them on. Some are calling this the coronavirus recession. It's happening so quickly. I've started calling it the flash recession. Some are predicting it's going to turn into Great Depression 2.0 or the unroaring 20s. One thing we do know is there is going to be an impact. And believe it or not, we did not know that a month ago. This was one of the first news briefings I saw on recession possibilities. It was from March 9th, 2 days before the World Health Organization declared coronavirus to be a pandemic. So it is going to cause an impact, but how bad is it going to be? There's lots of uncertainty to plan for right now. There are a lot of terms, a lot of scenarios being tossed around. Which one of these make the most sense? Which scenarios should we be planning for in a world where everything is up in the air? Now, I'm going to give you a primer on recession types. I'm not going to cover every one of these terms, but I'll cover the most common ones being bantered about. So I got this from the St. Louis Fed. They have a wonderful graph generator that lets you change what your statistics are, how you want the graph to be displayed, what time period. They even let you change things like width of them. It's all web-based, width of the lines. They let you even create formulas. You can divide one thing by the other thing. So what I did is I took the United States and I made a graph of the change to per capita GDP from 1977 to 2019. So basically, this is the change in each period of how much more the average person increased gross domestic product. So you see on the side that during an average year, it goes up, let's call it around $500 to $750 of GDP per person. If you're wondering why I started in 1977, because it lets us see something that happened at the start of the 1980s that I'm going to highlight in a little bit. The gray areas are officially acknowledged recessions. So first, we're going to talk about a V-shaped recession. This is the most common type. There's normally a triggering event, and then it passes, and then the economy gets back to growing. In 1990, we had what was called an oil price shock. Basically, the price of oil shot up. It reduced consumer spending, which in turn reduced corporate spending. In case you don't know, 70% of GDP, gross domestic product, is driven by consumer spending. So that drop in consumer spending and corporate spending, combined with a weakened economy due to some Federal Reserve actions that were designed to combat inflation, we had a drop followed by a rise. V-shaped recessions tend to be short. So this one lasted just 8 months. In 2001, 2002, we had a greater recession. It was partly caused by consumer spending fears related to 9/11. That was combined with the dot-com bubble bursting. It was a bigger dip in growth, but still essentially a V-shaped recovery. Also keep in mind that even though those were recessions, they didn't drop down below zero growth. It actually was positive growth, but it was close to zero and not really enough to keep up with the population expansion. We actually had this massive period of peacetime expansion that did end with something I'm going to get to in a second. So let's talk about W-shaped recessions. A W-shaped recession and recovery is essentially a drop, a rise that then makes us think we got over the recession, then another drop, and then a rise. Some cases, those second drops are governmentally caused, probably unintentionally, and this is one of those cases that I'll talk about. Some economists view these as two separate V-shaped recessions because economists define a recession generally as 2 or more quarters of declining GDP. So by default, if you have a growth in the middle, that's not a recession. So they don't really acknowledge a W-shaped recession. But when we see two V's put together, clearly that is one. Because we are still dealing with the ramifications of what caused the recession. So you eagle-eyed people on here quickly spotted a W-shaped recession in the early 1980s. This was a recession that we actually came out of fairly quickly, but the Federal Reserve started panicking because they were worried we're coming out of it too quickly. They were worried that inflation was going to rise, because we had this period in the 1970s called stagflation, where we had double-digit unemployment and double-digit inflation. So the Fed, under Paul Volcker, essentially panicked, raised interest rates. This caused us to drop into an even worse recessionary situation than we actually started in. A U-shaped recession is a steep drop followed by a slower rise. Now, when looking at that, you might go, Edward, that's really clearly a V-shaped recession. This is the recession that I was talking about, that ended the longest period of post-wartime recovery in American history. But this isn't the whole story of the Great Recession. I'm going to zoom in for a bit and look at how long it took us to come out of this recessionary dip. If you drill into it and look at GDP per capita, you'll see a drop from 2008 to 2009, followed by years of recovery to get us back up to the growth rate we were previously under. U-shaped recessions tend to look more like bathtubs or swimming pools. As you go from the deep end, or jumping off the high dive, then we kind of swim up to the shallow end, and then eventually get out of the pool. Now let's talk about the rarely seen, and many people believe hopefully extinct, L-shaped recession. This is what I consider to be the saber-toothed tiger / terrifying T-Rex dinosaur of recessions. To be clear, there have been a few L-shaped recessions in the last 100 years. Generally, these L-shaped recessions are a rapid drop followed by a correction to how the markets function. Essentially, we see a structural correction. Now, one happened in Japan only 30 years ago. Back in the 80s, the Japanese were on this path towards global domination. There was even this, I can't think of what the movie was. It was about Japan coming and taking over a US auto firm, starred Michael Keaton. But what happened was, excuse me, in the late 1980s, right around 1990, they had their bubble burst. Their investments in assets, suddenly people realized they're not worth what they're paying for them, and then they plummeted. That and some other governmental decisions. The government said that they believed technology was the future, but the future was not personal computers, it was large mainframes. I guess you could say they predicted the cloud 30 years too early. But what it did was it led to basically minimal growth for the entire 1990s, like 1% growth. We also saw this more recently in Greece, that had their own lost decade from 2007 to 2016. Like Japan, it was a decade-long correction to their economy. So, trivia question, has the US ever seen an L-shaped recession? We have people on today's conference from around the world, so has the world ever seen an L-shaped recession on a global scale? Yes. Let's go back to 1925. It was 5-ish years after the end of World War I. And T.S. Eliot said in his poem, The Hollow Men, which I'm finding myself quoting way too often these days, "This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends, not with a bang, but a whimper." And 4 years later, we had our very own L-shaped recession. In October 29, the US stock market collapsed, and bringing an end to the Roaring '20s. It caused reverberations around the world. Unemployment in the United States hit 23%. In some countries, unemployment went as high as 33%. We spent more than a decade getting back to where we were. Unemployment didn't get back under 10% until the US entered World War II in 1941. Now, supposedly this recession is in the shape of an L. I have to say it looks more like a check mark to me. So what type of recession are we facing, and how can we use EPM to plan for it? Because let's be honest with each other, we're going to have a recession, but what type? So according to an article a month ago in Harvard Business Review, it's almost definitely going to be a V-shaped recession. That is good for everyone. Now, the article doesn't say how deep the recession will be, nor does it say how long. It just says we should do multiple scenarios and we shouldn't trust any of them terribly much. If you read that whole article on hbr.org, and I encourage you to do so, you'll see that it talks about what will happen to the global domestic product if coronavirus triggers a recession. It has excellent statistical evidence to show that when a pandemic happens, a recession, or at least a drop in GDP growth, often happens as well. The good news is that based on their statistical evidence, these drops, these recessions, are what you all just learned about, V-shaped. Steep drop, steep recovery, no lasting damage. We don't reshape how our economy works, how the markets work for years to come. So I love this article, and I've been quoting it a lot over the last month because it was almost a crystal ball for what was going to happen when almost no one was talking about economic uncertainty. So let's look at a few other examples of pandemics that resulted in those V-shaped recessions. So since the Industrial Revolution, the granddaddy of all pandemics was that 1918 Spanish flu. Earth had 1.5 billion people, and a third of those, 500 million people, caught Spanish flu. 50 to 100 million people died. We don't know exactly how many. The mortality rate was so high, entire villages disappeared. There was no one left to tell us how many people actually died. We didn't have the data quality that we do now. But shockingly, we recovered very quickly. Some people wonder why this was called the Spanish flu, so fun little side tangent. It's not actually because Spain got it any worse than anywhere else. It wasn't called the Spanish flu because it started in Spain. It's actually called that because the world was at war. We were in the closing days of World War I. Governments around the world forbid news that would hurt the war effort in their specific country. Believe it or not, this was even true in the United States. We basically abandoned freedom of the press and passed what was called the Sedition Act. It wouldn't let newspapers report the truth. So you go back and look at articles from that time, and all those newspapers could say was, we're having a flu season, and it was kind of like any other. Why is it called the Spanish flu? Spain wasn't actually involved in the war then. So their journalists were reporting just how bad things actually were, and that up to 70% of people were getting the Spanish flu, and they were dying in record numbers. And what did Spain get for having freedom of the press back in 1918? We named a pandemic after them. 40 years later, the Asian flu. Over 100,000 dead in the US alone. There were around 175 million people in the US then, so roughly half, a little more than half of what we have now. But notice, steep V-shaped drop, steep V-shaped recovery. You're getting used to seeing this at this point. 10 years later, the Hong Kong flu. Poor Asia gets blamed a lot lately. And again, 100,000 US deaths. And while the changing growth rate did suffer, barely a blip on global GDP as it continued its nice upward climb. It's almost a reverse L shape, it's kind of a slower decline than a rapid increase out of it. Jumping ahead to the 21st century, SARS caused a decrease, and then we grew even faster coming out of it to the point that we almost hit that W-shaped recession because we ended up sort of in a heartbeat, but we didn't because we settled down to a reasonable growth rate. Again, rapid drop in GDP growth for 1 to 4 quarters, rapid increase in GDP growth for 1 to 4 quarters. So how do we weather that storm for this 1 to 4 quarters? How can we be best prepared for the recovery to follow? The answer is information. We have to grab information, use it to plan for our scenarios. Because this V-shaped recession, while they're not calling it that, while they're not quoting this awesome pandemic information like the Harvard Business Review article is, all the top economists, all the top investment firms are projecting a V-shaped recession. Steep decline followed by steep growth. So let's talk about scenario planning. As many of you know, I've been a huge proponent of it for the last 20 years. I've been preaching that we have to have a set of plans ready at hand. If this occurs, this is how we will respond. On March 9th, so again, before this was declared a pandemic, McKinsey said we should plan for 3 scenarios. Their most pessimistic case was what they called, rather gloom and doomy, a global pandemic resulting in recession. A week later, they said that's now our base case because the World Health Organization has said we are in a pandemic, it's going to cause a global recession. So they took their 3 scenarios down to 2 kind of versions of the last one. McKinsey's base case is now what's called a delayed recovery. As I said before, 70% of GDP is consumer spending. Now realize how many of us are not actually out spending. So in this scenario, we see this major drop in consumer and business spending until the end of Q2. That produces a recession because they're also predicted we're going to drop in Q1. That slump continues in some areas till the end of Q3. Their more pessimistic scenario, and I'm showing you this because I like the names of delayed recovery and prolonged contraction. The more pessimistic is a prolonged contraction that talks about GDP being damaged throughout most of 2020, the recovery not really beginning until the second quarter of 2021, so a year from now. Tracy McMullen showed you this graph earlier. It's what I see as the three most likely scenarios that we'll encounter. So I want you to look back on what she talked about. The red curve is the quick recovery. The blue curve is the delayed recovery. The green curve is the prolonged contraction. Now, both the red and the blue curves are those V-shaped recessions we just talked about. It's just a matter of how many quarters we go down and how many quarters it takes to go back up again. In my green curve, the prolonged contraction, I'm allowing for a bit more, as you can see, of a U-shaped recession, a couple quarters decrease, bottoming out for a bit, slow rise, kind of like a bathtub, not a good bathtub, not like this pleasant jacuzzi at the spa. Let's all pray to our respective gods that we don't end up in that green bathtub. Let's hope for red, or even better potentially, although I don't see how it's gonna only be a quarter. So most likely we're gonna be somewhere in the reddish blue area, but I think you should plan for all three. In that quick recovery scenario, we're gonna hit our peak of coronavirus cases in April, and the world will get back to spending by the end of June. It's gonna cause a decrease in revenue, primarily limited to the second quarter of 2020, April to June. If it extends into July, August, it recovers enough that Q3 is still higher revenue than Q2. So basically we're growing going into July, August, September. By the end of September, back to where we were at the start of 2020. Now do keep in mind at the start of 2020, we were running into already manufacturing slowdown. We already started to see the signals, the hints that there might be a recession coming, and this basically was a trigger. Now, if you're in this situation, if you think quick recovery is the most likely, you're probably focusing on short-term risk mitigation, conserving operating expenses, stabilizing the supply chain, trying to come out of this with immediate resumption of where we were, hopefully even stronger because we've gotten back to core principles. What do we do right? What we should not be in the business of doing? In the delayed recovery scenario, we don't hit our peak of coronavirus cases until summer. This causes a decrease in consumer spending over probably 2 quarters. Essentially, we keep dropping through September, and then we recover over the 4th quarter of this year and the 1st quarter of 2021. In this scenario, you've got to take some aggressive strategies. You've got to drive revenue. And at the same time, you have to understand what are my least profitable products, least profitable services, least profitable locations, and our least profitable customers so that we can, at least temporarily, suspend the things that are costing us money. In a delayed recovery scenario, layoffs are likely because it's going to take us a year to get back to normal. And let's talk about the bad one, the green bathtub, the prolonged contraction. This says we either don't hit our peak until late in 2020, or it comes in waves as quarantines are enacted, lifted, and then have to be reenacted. Imagine a V turns into W, turns into whatever you call 3 V's put together, the World Wide Web, I guess. So in this U-shaped type recession, we see 2 quarters of decrease, 2 to 4 quarters of bottoming out, and then a much slower rise out of a recession, probably taking 4 quarters or more to get back to where we were. That probably won't happen where we get back to the start of 2020 until sometime in 2022. Now, this is not meant to be scary. It's just something we have to plan for. It's something we have to prepare for. In this situation, companies need to return to the basics. We need to stop doing, likely permanently, the things that are costing us money. We have to focus on our most profitable products and services. We have to focus on our most profitable locations. We have to hold on to our key customers, that 20% of the customers that drive 80+% of your profitability. So my advice to begin with, take these 3 scenarios and go plan for them. Don't wait for someone to ask you to do it. Just go ahead and create them and then start tweaking them as data comes in, as you start managing and modifying what those versions might look like. But scenario planning is only one of the tools that we have to be doing right now. The good news, if you can find some, is that in times of massive upheaval, finance departments, any departments that crunch the numbers, like all of you on today's keynote, those departments go from being overhead to being the most important departments in the entire company. Why? Because during times of change, people crave information. I'm a massive believer in scenario planning, as you can tell from the last hour and the last 20 years. It's important to have plans ready at hand, not just a set of numbers that probably look really bad right now anyway. It's important to have a set of actions. If a situation occurs, we will take these actions to deal with it. But as Tracy mentioned at the start of the day, there are 4 other tools that are really important at times like this. Strategic modeling. This helps you figure out what your constraints are. When will you violate your debt covenants? When will you use up your available cash? When will you need greater capital lending? Profitability and cost management. Please don't wait on this one. You have products, you have services, you have locations, you have customers that are making you money. Find out which 20% of those are resulting in 80% of your profitability. But also find out what products you need to be stopping, what locations you need to be closing, what the 20% of your customers are that are costing you 80% of your profitability. Then take those unprofitable money drains and stop doing them now while you have liquidity. Data visualization and real-time analytics. You have to make sure that you're absorbing information as it comes in. As I showed you earlier, the situation is changing too rapidly to wait until the quarter closes to find out what happened. If there's data that will cause someone to take a different physical action or cause them to ask a deeper question, get it to them now. And narrative reporting. People think that narrative reporting should only be used after the fact, so we can explain, oh, here's why our budget and forecast were off from actuals. You need to use it ahead of time because you have to communicate internally all those scenarios you just planned for. You have to use it to communicate how you're going to respond when it's clear which scenario we're actually in. As many of you know, I'm a big believer in David Allen and his getting things done methodology. He always stresses knowing what your next physical action is. To be clear, waiting is not a physical action, hoping is not a strategy, and I'll think about it is really just a way of saying, I'm not going to think about it. So I told you at the beginning of this session that I wanted you and your department to be the most valuable, the most needed, most critical areas of your entire company. And to do that, like the rest of your company, you need additional information. Many of you have already visited IFN, interRel Finance News, to see all the relevant news stories for finance in your business. If you haven't, go to interRel.com/updates, bookmark it today. There's no advertising on this page. This isn't a site where you have to register for. It's not a site where you have to pay anything. That's what it looks like on a mobile device. These articles are from everyone, not just written by interRel. There are a bunch of articles, for instance, curated from other sites like CNBC, New York Times, Forbes, The Economist. Find one you like, click through it, it'll take you right to that article on that other location. Anybody who has free information to share that is relevant to finance, FP&A, I'm trying to get out there and share it with you. If you are too busy to go there once a day and see what's new, we've added the option to have the top 1 to 3 highest voted articles each day emailed to you. So if you want that, put your email address in. If you don't, if you just want to check on your own, don't ever put an email address in, just go out here. Oh, when you do go out to the website, you'll see there on the side out there, it says like 1742. We now let you upvote and downvote the articles that you want to see more of. So it not only controls which ones get emailed to you each day, but it helps us determine kind of what you're more interested in and what you really want to see. I've been trying to find points of optimism. Our amygdalas, that's the fear centers of our brain, have been in massive overdrive. In other words, every time we hear a rustle in the bushes, we are absolutely positive it's a saber-toothed tiger. But it turns out it's not always a tiger. Sometimes it's a nice person who just wants to offer you tasty berries, give you free information. So we have to pause periodically and remember it's not all bad. I was reading a blog from Dr. Paul Sachs. He's professor of immunology at Harvard Medical School. And he said there are actually areas for optimism. So the number 1 reason to be optimistic, the disease is mild in most people who get it. Number 2 reason to be optimistic is that children seem particularly protected from the worst parts of the disease. They don't seem to have those receptors in them, and their immune systems are very, very good at fighting it. And finally, he's optimistic that, at least in the scientific community, when it comes down to global survival, we're going to throw aside our petty differences, work together to save lives all over the planet. And it's hard to appreciate how different the mortality rate is between the young and the old. This doesn't mean they won't get it. They won't be very, very sick. It just means mortality rate wise, notice how low it is if you're 0 to 60. That doesn't mean it won't be bad. It will. Some of us are over 60. All of us have family members that are over 60. It will get bad, but there is reason for optimism. So I'm going to give you one more thing to be happy about. This is related to the impact of not traveling and hashtag working from home. I went and looked up crime statistics by day for the area I live in, Dallas-Fort Worth. The biggest city in the DFW metro area is Dallas, and crime across the board, violent crime, nonviolent crime, it's down 15% March this year versus last year. And no, the Dallas Police Department aren't relaxing arrests or anything. They're actually following the exact same protocols as last year. People are just being home, and we're working together. We're trying to keep each other safe. And in case you think it's just Dallas, there are at least 4 other cities I have found that report their data each day. This is from the Marshall Project, who actually went out to all those websites. We are seeing in some areas, San Francisco, as much as 42% decline, 22% in Detroit, 19% in LA, and 13% in Chicago. These are some of the biggest areas in the entire United States. New York, based on their police chief, said their crime is down 20%. You might actually see some benefits coming out of this, because at the end of the day, coronavirus makes us realize it's not a matter of us versus them. It's not the good guys versus the bad guys. It's not one country versus another country. It's all of humanity against a virus, and that is a battle that we are going to win. Tracy mentioned this quote this morning, and I want to come back to it for a second. This is what they call in the stand-up comedy biz a callback. After the COVID crisis ends, there will be 2 categories of companies: the ones that don't do anything and just hope this doesn't happen again, and the ones who make investments in their future. Just make sure in the long term, you're one of the winners. I want to say thank you to our many, many information sources, including each and every one of you. I want to know what resonated most with you today, so go tweet something valuable you learned. Tag me, I will retweet it, I will follow you. We'll see if we should do conferences like this again if you're learning things. We're all going to survive together, and we're all going to thrive together. We just have to keep communicating. Social distancing does not mean we have to stop communicating. I actually prefer the term physical distancing. So go connect, go talk to one other person today. If you can't figure out what to talk about, discuss something you learned today. Discuss scenario planning, for instance. Do it over Zoom, go to Meeting, WebEx, FaceTime, Facebook Messenger, Microsoft Teams, Google Hangouts, Skype, or one of those newfangled phone contraptions. However you do it, just commit to talking to someone today. Go make yourself important. I'm broadcasting today from the great state of Texas. We're trying to keep up our spirits down here, so let me close with one small bit of Texan hand washing advice. I want you to wash your hands like you just got done slicing jalapenos for a batch of nachos. You need to take your contacts out, y'all. Fun fact, you can ask a certain at-home smart device whose name I can't say out loud, but